Okay, started. Ayada, over to you.
All right, thank you, Adam. We'll just give people a few minutes to
Okay.
join. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we'll give people just a couple of minutes, and We'll start exactly at 6:05. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us on this important discussion on the political economy of war in Sudan, hosted by the International Development Economics Associates. My name is Mayad Hassanin. Ideas is it's a global network of economists, researchers, and activists committed to promoting equitable, sustainable, and pluralist approaches to development economics especially from the perspective of the Global South. So before we start, I will get some housekeeping out of the way. So this webinar will last for roughly 90 minutes. We'll try to keep the interventions to approximately 50 minutes or so we can have a good 30 minutes for Q&A. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to pose your questions, and hopefully we'll have enough time to address all of them at the end. So I'm wearing two hats today. I'll be moderating the discussion as well as speaking briefly in the beginning. So first I want to introduce our speakers. Majdi Jazuli, who is a scholar from Sudan. He writes on his blog, Still Sudan, at a newspaper. He's a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute, and his work focuses on political economy and intellectual history. Our third speaker after me is Mohammed Amin, who's a Sudanese journalist specializing in geopolitics and human rights abuses in Sudan, South Sudan, and elsewhere in Northeast Africa. He works for many regional international media outlets, including Bloomberg, Middle East Eye, Voices of America. In November of 2022, the Rory Peck Trust awarded him the Martin Adler Prize for his work in Middle East Eye, in which he covered the Wagner Group massacres and the Sudanese coup. So as all of you, of course, know, Sudan is currently facing what the United Nations is calling the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with more than half the population, about 30 million people in need of aid, and around 12 million displaced, both internally and outside of the borders as refugees. The war between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, ongoing since April of 2023, has taken the lives of approximately 150,000 people. It has devastated infrastructure, collapsed public services, and has led the country into one of the worst economic turns since its independence. Currently, cities like Al-Fashir, which are under siege by the RSF, hold approximately 260,000 civilians who face famine, constant shelling, and harrowing conditions. Reporting on Sudan has not only been far too moderate given the extent of the catastrophe, however, it has additionally flattened the conflict to a case of another African civil war, best explained by two power-hungry generals and an African propensity towards violence and instability. Given that I'm going first, I've chosen to use my time to frame what I believe are some of the key issues or key lenses through which we can understand this war. As I reflected on how best to do that, I've decided to begin by clarifying some of the sort of myths I believe are surrounding the war. And my intention is not to respond to these narratives directly, but rather to attempt to demystify the complex economic and political processes that underpin the current conflict. So firstly, I think the current war in Sudan can be understood as part of a relentless process of primitive accumulation, a violent and ongoing mechanism through which capital continues to expand by dispossessing people of the means of survival and reproduction. While this process is not unique to Sudan, as it is applied in the country, its intensity is shaped by the country's racial, geographic, and political complexities, which expose the inherent tendencies of capitalism and imperialism, revealing the hierarchies and tensions that they generate. And it also demonstrates how through technological advances, propaganda, and a pervasive global apathy towards the lives and well-being of Sudanese people, these systems conceal their destructive efforts. The global pressures intensified by the COVID-19 crisis and the debt crisis that followed have had devastating consequences for Sudan. These crises were compounded by the persistent imposition of IMF-led structural adjustment programs, which enforced austerity-like measures, including subsidy removal, currency devaluation, and cuts in public expenditure. Together, these forces deepened the conditions of economic precarity and dependency that made Sudan particularly vulnerable in the current war, given, of course, the political chaos which ensued after the secession of South Sudan and the compounded impacts of Bashir's 30-year reign. Concrete examples of this dynamic of accumulation, which has been facilitated and mediated by the war, can be seen across key sectors of the economy, including gold, which is, of course, going to be covered a little bit more in depth by my colleague Mohammed Amin, which have, in 2014, have been sold or exported out of Sudan undercut by 30% of the below market value. Export processes have increasingly been characterized by the elimination of formal frictions, such as accounting systems, wages, and environmental or safety regulations. For example, in a report published by a newspaper on the Sudanese Arabic, is documented how the sector has been severely disrupted by the ongoing war. And according to the Central Bank's 2024 Foreign Trade Report, Sudan officially exported 70,000 metric tons of gum Arabic, the lowest level since 2017. Whereas in between 2015 and 2022, this had peaked at times at 100,000 tons. Yet in the same period, there was a sharp rise in gum Arabic exports from Chad, totaling approximately 50 to 70,000 tons between October of 23 and September of 24. This coincides with reports that the Rapid Support Forces looted and smuggled large quantities of gum Arabic from Sudan over to the western border to be re-exported to destinations, including India and Pakistan. This war has also created a disposable labor force, evident in the rise of artisanal miners working under brutal and unsafe conditions, mirroring the reliance of capitalism in the periphery to create conditions where profitability depends on suspending the very rules that ostensibly govern free markets. This conflict is therefore not an aberration, but an intensification of existing dynamics through several interlinked processes. Dismantling an already weak institutional capacity to regulate resources, displacing populations to become cheap, flexible labor in global markets, and enacting violence which fragments and atomizes collective resistance that we have seen throughout the 4 years of the revolution which sparked in 2018, ensuring that there is little challenge to prevailing orders. This war has also functioned as a disciplining tool for Sudanese labor. It has destroyed material and social conditions that make resistance to economic exploitation possible through the direct violence enacted over the course of the past 2 years, or through the production of the perfect neoliberal subject, either consumed by the pursuit of individual happiness through consumerism, or too exhausted and impoverished by the struggle to meet privatized needs, to imagine or organize political resistance. Secondly, I'm thinking about the recent reporting by reputable outlets, including The Guardian, which has spoken about the presence of foreign soldiers fighting alongside in the Darfur region, alongside RSF in the Darfur region. A recent article published by The Guardian spoke about Colombian recruits, which apparently are being paid around 2,600 US dollars, comparable to the wages of mid or even senior level aid workers elsewhere in Sudan. This phenomenon, I believe, is closely tied to the structural failures of global job markets, which have been unable to absorb large numbers into regular employment. These Colombian soldiers, as they were interviewed, come from a vast pool of trained soldiers who retire at around 40 years of age with a poor pension system and almost very little capacity of integration into civilian work. With having at least 2 decades of working life ahead of them and few opportunities and many conflicts to choose from. And so this should not be understood as also another propensity for violence, but rather as a response to economic processes. In fact, Sudanese soldiers themselves were once recruited to fight in Yemen, where they were reported being paid monthly salaries in USD, much higher than their wages in Sudan. For these men, especially of fighting aid, this was seen as an employment opportunity, and that at a time when the Sudanese economy was collapsing, particularly after the loss of oil reserves, which triggered budgetary and debt crises. The government lost its fragile and fleeting equilibrium, once sustained by a modestly vibrant urban service sector and rural economy that was already struggling and suppressed under the authoritarian regime of al-Bashir. The secession of South Sudan and the loss of oil reserves were perhaps a watershed moment for Sudan. After 2013, the government attempted to turn to gold as a new foreign exchange lifeline, but this offer failed. It was an entirely different commodity, the geographical spread, the knowledge required for its extraction, and the interest of those controlling its production and those purchasing it abroad made it impossible for the state to capture or regulate through formal channels. This was one such way that the RSF not only became an economic powerhouse, but also an independent negotiator of business and trade deals. The current war must therefore also be understood as shaped by a broader economic trajectory, which has produced jobless growth in many places or no growth at all. Across post-colonial settings, millions are being left disenfranchised, economically excluded, and ready to be absorbed into a militarized job market. Livelihoods and violence have become systematically enmeshed. The third issue that I would like to highlight is that this war has resulted in extreme pressure on women and on social reproduction processes more broadly. Given rise to what feminists have termed militarized social reproduction, this war has had obviously devastating individual and economic consequences, diverting resources from public welfare to the military apparatus precisely when the need for social provisioning is growing. Under these conditions, the responsibility for ensuring the well-being of communities falls disproportionately on women. In Sudan, prior to the war, there remained strong remnants of communal-based living whereby access to livelihood opportunities was still mediated through non-wage means. Despite the infiltration of markets and the ethos of individualism, these forces had not fully penetrated Sudanese society, particularly in peri-urban and rural areas. All of this now is being eroded, piecemeal through financial strain and rising costs, as well as immediately through the destruction of means of reproduction. For example, in Al Jazeera, RSF troops have repeatedly targeted farming equipment, stealing, burning, looting, and so on. Social reproduction is therefore taking place under extreme circumstances, and the current war continues to test resilience. The pervasive and systemic use of sexual violence must be understood as also part of an effort to dismantle family and community ties, which have long represented key sites of resistance and endurance of forms of production and reproduction that contradict capitalist relations. This violence also functions as a means of dispossessing women of bodily autonomy. Sexual and gender-based violence systemically reduce dissent, increasing the likelihood that people, as we have seen when the entry into Khartoum, Jazeera, Sinnar, and so on, people will flee their homes, therefore making these spaces easier to occupy. The mass expulsion of people from their land through extreme violence is part of the broader reorganization of social reproduction. This process has been evidenced, as I've said, in several states. And Sudanese women face a double bind, where the simultaneous separation from and devaluation of their reproductive labor, coupled with their forced entry into paid and productive work as a means of survival. The basic needs of survival, food, housing, education, healthcare, can now only be met through militarized markets. Women's participation in labor markets, either as entrepreneurs or as paid workers within and outside of Sudan, has produced new layers of exploitation, creating more exploitable workers while ensuring that social reproduction and care continue to subsidize capitalist relations. Sudanese women are now facing what some scholars have termed depletion through social reproduction, happening at multiple levels, at the individuals themselves who engage in social reproductive labor, who are experiencing extreme physical and mental strain, the household, whose members are no longer receiving adequate care and support, and the community, where the breakdown of social bonds and the shrinking space for collective mobilization are increasingly shrinking. The non-commodified social relations through which people once accessed land, labor, and food for their reproduction are violently and systematically being eroded as part of the war. I will stop there, and I will hand over to my colleague Majdi, who will take us through his part.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I have prepared a few notes on Sudan's deaths, but I'll kick you off with something from my own childhood. There was a TV program when I grew up. It aired on Friday, and it included a children's program. So it did a bit of theater and then some songs. And one of the favorite songs of the time was a song about seasons. And so it was supposed to teach people about seasons or teach children about seasons. So it said that there are 4 seasons in the year. I'll say what is it? الصيف وخريف والربيع والشتاء, also summer and then autumn and then winter and then spring, and it goes around that. But it's an Arabic song, so it goes and you can sort of there's a bit of a chorus around it. It's quite a nice song anyway, children's song. Now that's the standard description of what the weather is like in many places. In Sudan, there is this idea that there are only 2 seasons in a year, and these 2 seasons are the rainy season and the dry season. And because there's one long season of dryness, and then there's a brief period of 2-3 years of rain. And in the same fashion, people have been talking for a long time about Sudan's political history as a record of periods of brief democracy and long periods of dictatorship, something like the long dry season and the short rainy season. And you can get these dualities or these pairs of contradictions in many different forms. So you'll get people talking about military, civilian, you'll get Arab and African, you'll get Muslim and Christian, you'll get, of course, and the most famous and the most recent probably entrant to this field of dualities is the idea of a permanent center and a permanent periphery. And of course, these are all interesting ways to look at a complex country like Sudan, but they don't necessarily explain everything. And so I'll begin with this dictatorship, democracy duality, or military civilian duality, or periods of democracy and periods of dictatorship. And this is in Sudanese literature on the country. It's called the vicious cycle of Sudan. Some foreign authors have taken up this description and use it, but it's essentially something that the Sudanese commentators or authors on political history have used to explain their predicament. Now, my suggestion to this is that there's alternative ways of looking at that history, and I would invite you to look beyond the rainy and the dry season into sort of subtleties of the 4 seasons in Sudan, although they're not easy to decipher. It's hard to work out when is spring in Sudan. It's also very hard to work out where does winter really start and end, but it's possible. You can, if you live in the country, work out the winter days and work out the 2-3 days of spring. And I think these days correspond to records of commodities in Sudan, histories of commodities. And my invitation to you is to look as economists or as the people who are interested in the economic history of these places, beyond the dictatorship, democracy or military civilian or center periphery, into the records of commodities. And essentially it's a record of export commodities, to be very specific, because Sudan from the very beginning of the modern state has been tied up very much to a global market. It has never developed an internally stratified market with sufficient sophistication to be self-satisfying. It always relied on a foreign market. And this goes even earlier than sort of the history of the modern state. So you can read about Sudan's relationship and the collapse or the rise and collapse of states in the Sahelian belt or in the River Nile in relation to export relations with the Arab Hijaz or with Egypt. You can read something like this about the fate of Sinnar, for instance, or the fate of the Darfur Sultanate in the the heroic age of Sudan. This fate was sealed in relation to sort of external trade. So external trade is a bit of a critical thing to think about. And once upon a time, Sudan traded in the age of slavery. Sudan's main export commodity was slaves. In the modern age, it entered modernity with the first major cash crop, which was cotton. Cotton underlied Sudan's economy for a good 20 years, up to 1970, 75. During these 20 years, the state in central Sudan flourished, but it was a state based on oil, based on cotton. It's essentially a cotton state. It trained, its investment in public health, in education, in science was geared towards the cotton economy because this is Sudan's main export commodity. And if before we started this webinar, I talked to my colleagues about the work of Ali Abdelgader Ali, a Sudanese economist who has written mostly in Arabic, so he's a bit sort of a silent in the English-speaking world. But he has written critically about Sudan's relationship with the World Bank and the IMF since that era. And just to remind you, when commodities like cotton cheapened in the early 70s, the price of cotton began to deteriorate. Sudan couldn't keep up. Its productivity of cotton also deteriorated from somewhere around 0.6 ton per feddan to 0.3 ton per feddan in 1980. This reduction in productivity was because Sudan could not invest in the capital commodities necessary to increase production, because it had a relatively cheap commodity on the market to sell, and it needed to buy very expensive items from the market to maintain that commodity, be this technology or be this, the most simple explanation really is fuel. And anybody of the listeners who knows anything about economic history would know that there were two big oil crises in the 1970s, 1973, 1979. The price of a barrel of oil increased from something around $3 in the beginning of the 70s to something in the range of $40 in the 1980s. At the early 80s, sort of 1980, the price was $35 to $40. This increase was never accounted for by any bureaucrat in Khartoum. They could not foresee that there would be such an immense rise in oil prices. And this increased rise in fuel prices, which is the most critical factor in Sudanese agriculture in the central the central irrigated lands or mechanized farming projects of Jazeera and Gadarif, and where most of the cotton was grown in the Managil extension, it depended very much on that imported oil, and Sudan never had oil production of its own. So this essentially ransacked the 1970s development decade. So the main factor that led to the defeat of these very ambitious projects in the 1970s, where Sudan borrowed heavily from the IMF, from the World Bank, borrowed heavily from Arab Gulf investors with the hope of paying that money back once production picked up and once they could increase productivity of the feddan of cotton or of sugar or of any other cash crop, if you start thinking about varieties in production like the ambitious Kanana sugar project and others. All these productivity promise didn't materialize simply because a critical factor was beyond their control. They could not account for the increase in oil prices. And another thing happened is that some of the very thoughtful authors of Sudan noticed already at the time is that the increase in the prices of oil also meant that the Arab Gulf market became a terribly attractive market for Sudanese labor, which in many ways meant that Sudan's investment in human capital in the 1960s, which is quite a heavy investment in human capital, scholarships, bursaries, paid university stays, expatriation abroad, scholarship in the US, in the UK, and so on and so forth. It invested a lot of money in the type of people who would be plucked to work in the Gulf in the early 70s up to sort of the 1980s. There was an hemorrhaging of skilled labor, a hemorrhaging of professionals, a hemorrhaging of even manual labor to Arab Gulf countries, which were paying much higher salaries, and which meant that you were not only losing the direct investment that you were making in agriculture, which when you look at the figures were not nothing. These figures are quite impressive, how much money the Sudan government, irrespective of whoever was ruling, even nasty Nimeri, invested considerable amounts of money in agriculture with the idea that they could recover productivity of the feddan in whatever sector possible. However, they faced these two big challenges. Of course, there was misplanning and whatever and corruption. That's also very true. But there are two objective things that were sort of hard to manage, and they are related to global processes. And I think the most critical one among them is the global increase, the massive increase, the exponential increase in oil prices that had a sort of a shocking effect on the Sudanese economy. When the developmental decade, the wasted decade of development, as it's termed in African studies, whatever that means, ended, Sudan had a debt bill of $9 billion US. This was essentially money borrowed through that decade from the IMF, from the World Bank, and from Arab Gulf financiers or funds or banks and governments, of course, from the Club of Paris, to finance agriculture, to recover agriculture, and it didn't recover. By the time Numeri's era ended, by 1985, the productivity of the Faddan of cotton was half the productivity of the 1970s. And there was no way of recovering that without without spending a lot of capital, once again, in technology and infrastructure, and of course, paying for all that expensive fuel. Now, your good expatriates by that time were starting to send money home. However, the money that was coming home was sort of saddled by the problem that Abdul Khalik Mahjoub diagnosed already in 1967, that the private sector would sort of solidify money in real estate and thereby waste the opportunity to sort of spur production by private entrepreneurship and creativity. And it is very true. The figures that Abdul Khalik cited in 1967 were something like 60%, around 60% of private investment returns from agriculture were being reinvested in real estate, which means that money was being turned into cement blocks, bricks, these lovely septic tanks, and the massive furniture of these lovely multi-story homes. Now, this was a form of security, of course, and the returning expatriates maintained that trend. They would continue pouring money into real estate, and many who know Khartoum of the 1980s and 90s up to 2000 will probably know what type of real estate bubble dominated in the country. There were houses in Khartoum that you would buy for prices that are only comparable to Beverly Hills or more. You could pay $1 million US for a house in Shara Sittin or somewhere like that, which essentially didn't have running water, and electricity supply was scanty, and you'd have spent a lot of money to maintain 24-hour electricity, but it still cost $1 million US, because real estate became at the expense, as productivity of agriculture deteriorated, real estate became the only reasonable security for a bank loan. So if you go to a bank wanting to put money into a business or even establish a new entrepreneurial activity, most banks would require you to deliver security in the form of real estate or urban land, which meant that urban land was becoming a subject of considerable speculation between banks and landowners. And this led to this extreme waste of money in the form of real estate, except in the form of land, and of course, these many cars that were roaming Khartoum. So the point that I want to make here is that there were structural causes that causes all this wasting of funds, wherever they are. And these structural causes are not necessarily, some of them are factors that Sudan cannot control. When, of course, these $9 billion US that Numeri left over as a debt trap for Sudan were judiciously ignored by the government of Umar al-Bashir, to be very frank. They ignored that debt and they started looking for alternative sources of loans. And of course, they managed to organize some of that money from China and from Malaysia and other investors in the oil sector, with the idea that they wanted to solve the critical problem facing Sudan, which is how to supply this economy with a lot of cheap oil. since any economist at the time, including Abu Harira during the democracy, recognized that the main issue is how do we get out of the oil, how do we clarify, how do we clear our very high oil bill. And of course, Sudan did produce oil, but at considerable environmental cost, of course, and at considerable cost to, and considerable military cost. It waged a long and terrible war in southern Sudan that cost a lot of human lives and a lot of tragedy. And that war ended with the loss of the main source that was the war was fought over, which was essentially oil. And in fact, if you want to date this, the deterioration in Sudan, the current deterioration of Sudan's finances, it goes back, as Mayada said already, to that loss of oil in 2011. Overnight, the government of Sudan lost 75% of its foreign exchange earnings. 45% of general government finances went out of the window. It's a budgetary loss of $300 million per month. Inflation soared after a period of of calm and stability that the few of you who know Sudan would remember at these flourishing months, flourishing years during the period of the comprehensive peace agreement. And the Sudanese currency began to deteriorate in sort of big jumps down, essentially because Sudan had nothing to offer to the global market. It took another 5 years or so for Sudan to recover not the pre-oil levels, but at least some level of stable foreign currency earnings through essentially roaming the land for gold. And of course, each commodity brings its own security mechanisms around it. Now, the oil economy depended on principal installations in southern Sudan and Khartoum and Port Sudan and a long pipeline. It's something that you can guard with a disciplined military force. And this disciplined military force can leave the rest of the country in shatters. It doesn't matter. The most important thing is how to guard this oil line. And of course, the government of Sudan concentrated its efforts using a combination of tools. So there were militias employed in southern Sudan to guard the installations. But once that oil pipeline entered sort of the less war-prone regions of the country, it was essentially a safe passage. There was nothing to harm that oil, and you didn't need to recruit anybody else to guard that oil. Now, gold is a different commodity altogether. It is spread across locations geographically that Muhammad Amin can tell you about if he finds the time when I stop talking. And it works through smuggling routes. To control that commodity, you need a lot of firepower, and you need a lot of men who are ready to chase around smugglers in this part of the country or the other. Not only chase them around, make deals with them that would allow, or themselves do the smuggling, that would allow for the government to share some of the portion, some of the income of that gold. And the new commodity defined the type of military strategy that Sudan would follow, first in the recruitment of forces, but also in their organization. And essentially, the rapid support forces are in one part an outgrowth of counterinsurgency in the Chip in Darfur in the early 2000s, but also of the gold rush, which required a large mobile force spread across the vast geography of Sudan that the few of you who know the country will know it's very hard to govern or to move around. You need a lot of cars that are capable of running at long distances. The best car ever is aptly named Margaret Thatcher. So as you know, that's the name of that's the local name of the Land Cruiser that fighters in Sudan use with a mounted machine gun. It's named the Thatcher, and it's a very reasonable name, I think. It's solid, and it's unrelenting, and it's a killing machine. And I think many the Sudanese recognize that link even without knowing that link, but they recognize what that link means. So before I conclude, I want to say when 2019 came, the debts that Sudan decided to ignore during the 90s and 2000s had ballooned with services and interest rates and so on, to something like $60,000. That's the depth of the debt trap that Ibrahim al-Badawi diagnosed in 2019. He said the country is in a debt trap of $60 billion. But of course, you can't take a state to prison. He could have also equally followed the line followed by his predecessors of ignoring that debt and maintaining alternative relations, alternative sources, whatever that is, China, India, Malaysia, of funding. But it was Sudan really had exhausted many of its possibilities, and it went back to the IMF and the World Bank. The people who started doing that going back were not, to be honest, Ibrahim al-Badi. It was Umar al-Bashir in 2018 when he started sort of renegotiations with the IMF about means of restructuring Sudan's debt and accessing new loans. And the first condition the IMF named was something that it has been telling Sudan already in 1972, and that Sudan imposed in 1978 with the first devaluation of the Sudanese pound. It was telling the government to devalue the pound, float the currency, lift subsidies, open the markets for foreign capital, and essentially impose the 10 commandments of the Washington Consensus, irrespective of consequences. Of course, he had limited options. He wiggled around for a while. Eventually, he started imposing these, enforcing some of these measures. And in one way, the 2018-19 eruption is an immediate response to these measures, to the floating of the currency, the removal, the lifting of subsidies on fuel, and basically and essentially on food, on wheat, and the type of economic measures that Sudan was imposing. Now, the $60 billion US dollars debt trap remained where it is. And it was Western powers who in 2019, 2021, during the interregnum between, revolution and war, who used that number to force Sudan to take on measures that would, under other conditions, not enforce. For instance, it was with this means that the essentially the US, forced Sudan to accede to the Abraham Accords, for instance. And of course, there were people in Sudan ready to impose these IMF prescriptions by word and letter, out of ideological conviction, as well as out of immediate professional interests. These were their employers, really. So they were in many ways employed by the World Bank and the IMF to carry out these measures. And I think the current situation we're in should be read against this transition from one export commodity on the other. And it's not a transition that Sudan chooses. It's essentially a transition that Sudan is forced into by market forces. So you can see the transition from cotton to oil to gold, which each military regime way of securing the country or guarding this particular commodity commensurate to that new way of doing things in Khartoum and in the countryside. And of course, a bit move away from this idea that it's all about the men at the top. At many times, the options available to whoever is planning policy in Sudan are quite limited. And I think recognizing that is important going forward. At many times, the people who would call the shots don't really have many choices. The economy of the country restricts and forces them to make options that would, under different conditions, not be possible. You would have to be really creative to come out of a $9 billion US debt and sign up an agreement with the Chinese to start oil. As much as we detest that line of reasoning, there is a creative application of international relations behind it. And I think such a creative application of international relations is necessary at a moment when wherever you go back to Western donors, they tell you to pay back these $60 billion US, or they would force policy conditionalities on whatever government takes office that will essentially lead into the implosion we're just talking about. I think I should shut up here. No? Mayada, isn't enough? Yeah. Shut up.
Thank you very much, Majdi. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miyada, and thank you for the institution. Thank you, Magdi. As usual, this is a great contextualization of the topic. I like your point about the symbolism of Margaret Thatcher. So, I would like maybe to take it from there that talking about the gold itself in Sudan is I mean only about gold. I mean picking the gold from the inside the political economy of Sudan and the political economy of the war is something maybe sometimes tricky. So this is why I love the contextualization that Mayada and Magdi made here in their presentation. So, but even if we talk about the gold in itself, we need to put it in the scene of everything around the gold. Uh, so there are like two narratives actually talking about the gold. There is one which is highlighted in the media, being exposed, and there is another narrative of the grassroots that is not coming up to now, and that's for really many, for me, systematic reasons. So. Uh, this tricky narrative is actually talking about only the gold, about the gold that is standing behind the root causes of the war, the gold mining and the gold exports of Sudan that is prolonging the war. Um, and driving the majority actually of the reasons behind it. So for some deepening of this narrative, they sometimes talking about the exploitation that related to the gold. I mean, in terms of damaging the environment, in terms of creating some kind of land disputes, and this kind of narrative. On the top of this, there are also some calls of sanctioning or blocking the Sudanese gold itself. So it's and in this point, it's we discover how this. Is actually tricky narrative. Um, so I'm trying to talk about some alternative points that can change this kind of narrative. Like uh, we can talk about the idea of preventing the exports of the Sudanese gold. I mean, from the side of the government, from the side of the people of the country, so we can at least can get some benefits of that, like. Uh, this can be a kind of opening the doors of planning economy. It can be help in the and giving the priority for the agriculture. It can strengthen the local currency and increasing its value, decreasing the inflation, enable the government to control and monitoring the market of the gold itself. To prove this, the difference between these two narrative, we can stress here that for the purpose of this contextualization of the conflict, we have to analyze the general political economy, as I said. So despite all these things, we have not to focus only on the gold, to be honest, as I mentioned. It's they were talking about this resource as an internally created problems because of the conflict of interest around it, but also resources like others that created wide ambitions around it and from the globe. So I believe that the world has also created the economic problems of the country, being for Sudan being dependent for because of the debts, because of the adoption of the IMF policies, etc., of what Magdi mentioned. This is are the main reasons behind the political economy of the gold and behind the political economy of the country. I can mention here like some few examples of this, and it's also related to the gold and related to the destination that we are currently in Sudan amid this like nearly 3 years of war. It's like some questions that I'm going to throw, and yeah, maybe we can discuss it later on with more in depth. Like the question of who created the RSF? Is it only only Bashir government or the UAE that's use the RSF in the Yemeni war in the first place? The European Union that using the RSF as well in the stop of the illegal migration, and that was the main sources income of source of income to the RSF in 2015, 16, 17, and so on. Even when the revolution in Sudan and the success of at least bringing down the former president, it's the compromise of the revolution itself by the international community and the enforcement of what called the partnership between the government, the military and civilians, and it's actually a compromise of creating a hybrid government between the old regime and the new liberals that rule the country from 2019 up to the eruption of the war. And we can see that during that period, the wide facilities that the RSF and its leader have in the country, Hemeti, by that time he was the head of what called the commodity committees, which is control the export and imports of the country. His brother Abdurrahim Dagalu, he was head of a subcommittee within this committee controlling the gold exports. Apart from the brutality of the RSF and its bad reputation, Abdurrahim Dagalu himself, he was the owner of a unit company, which is one of the biggest gold mining country by that time and up to now. And it's clear, at least the conflict of interest in this and the other crimes behind that. So, and we look at these contradictions. I mean, for example, I mean, of the international pressures and of the liberals who are representing the international community during the period of 2019-2023, even adoption of the IMF policies in not just in the entire economy of the country, even in the gold, because with the advice of the IMF, they enforce more taxes on the gold and that directly affecting even the artisans, those millions of people who get benefit from the gold. Even we in the media, we suffered also from the focusing on the Russian and Chinese investments in the Sudanese gold, and it's true that there are a lot of questions and corruption around the Russian and Chinese investment, but I mean in gold sector, but there are also Australian and Canadian companies that still been in the shadow, and you might be heard about the controversiality about the Block 14, where these companies are working there. So it's Uh, maybe this even someone saying that this is before the war, and all what I mentioned is in the time before the war. Although it's this dynamic is put in the two sides. I mean the two capitalist powers, the SAF and the RSF in a competition over the gold, over the controlling of the bypassing networks that is facing the international sanctions. But it's not just about the competition, and it's, I mean, the role of the international community and the role of the giant companies. We can see that even after the war, the giant companies, they are still supporting this, like for the Volkswagen, for example, company which bought some of the Sudanese gold. We can see even the Switzerland-based Valcambi company, which is also bought part of the Sudanese gold. And in a big contradiction that Switzerland is a place that hosted the talks for peace in Sudan. We have also many other indicators of other companies, I mean, apart from the gold, like the French companies that is still buying the smuggled Sudanese gold by the RSF through Chad and other areas, like, I mean, namely talking about Nexira and Alan Robert. So it's this is the main political economy that is around the gold and fueling the continuation of the war. Although the countries that is witnessing this dynamics and what happened by these companies is talking about the peace in Sudan, which is they are very far from. So going to the gold in itself, in terms of the period after the war, we have seen that a lot of sanctions imposed in Sudan. We have to mention here that this network that being targeted is something old that's inherited from the Bashir's time, but it's also going through many changes from time to time. It's started in the period of 1997 until 2017, when it has been partially lifted in a deal with the Bashir's regime and the United States. Then it has been lifted in 2021 in another deal with the government of the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and we know the conditions behind that, which is Migdi actually talked about, and I add to this that Sudan has been enforced also to pay $300 million as a compensation for the families of the victims of the terrorist attacks against the U.S. embassies. And with all the solidarity with those victims, but they have to go and ask the government that stood behind the terrorism not to push the Sudanese people to pay this from the market during the coronavirus. That was one of the point that helped contributed to the economic hardship that paved the way for the military coup in 2021 as well. So now, and after the war, and the amounting of the international sanctions, we have seen that the old network that in the past consisted of the both actually SAF and RSF. So they are now trying to change the tactic of how they do the bypassing or avoiding this avoiding these sanctions, and they are get the help of many countries. They are getting the help of many international companies, changing names, changing the owners, doing concessions from. I think still have some time or hello?
Yes, Mohammed, we're here. Yes, I mean, you can have like maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay.
We have, I think we don't have a lot of questions so far, so you can proceed. It's okay.
Okay. So I will end maybe with the competition that lead to the world, the competition between the I mean the regional powers like we say UAE from one side, which is supporting the RSF, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and others who are supporting the SAF. And this even before the eruption of the war, it has also mounted feed the competition between the two sides in different sectors, in different economic sectors. I mean, not just the gold, it's even by the ignited the competition in the banking system. I ignited the competition in agricultural schemes and the many deals that signed between the transitional government and the UAE over الفشق agriculture scheme, Abu Umama seaport, that's 6 billion project on the Red Sea state, Al Hawad agricultural scheme, which is actually millions of fiddens in River Nile and Eastern Sudan, middle of Sudan. So and there is a kind of competition between the RSF. The RSF has been deployed in some places to protect these um, investments. So all these things have led to the to intensify the competition between the two. I mean, local warring parties who are representing the interests of the regional international community behind. And we have seen that after the war, now the two sides have actually confiscated the gold areas that controlled by this part or another, like the RSF is now controlling the entire military gold mining gold areas in Kurdufan and in Darfur, and we have seen the same happen by the RSF, by the SAF in River Nile and northern state, Red Sea state. Uh, we have seen also the flourishing of the mining in the former rebels control areas like Abdul Wahid al-Nur in Marra Mountains in Darfur, and Abdulaziz Al Helu, the SPLM North in South Kordofan. And all those groups, they need uh, a kind of bypassing networks in order to be able to get access to the market, and and this overlapping of the gold with the bypassing process. It's also opened the doors for more intervention from the neighboring countries. Um, I would like to end with the models. I mean, quickly the models that appeared in the production of the gold in Sudan. Just to give a background, that it started in 2012. It has been small economy of small artisans in the majority of the country, and it flourished in 2013, 2014, 15, and millions of people actually joined it, live in the agriculture production. And then we have seen the many local and foreign companies that working in the tailing of the gold. That means locally Karta. Then after the 2021 military coup and the need of the military to cover the gap of the withdrawal actually of at least to say the promises of financial support from the international community. They control directly a lot of that called, we can call it, it's al-ahwad, that's the squares of the gold that being confiscated by the SAF. And this has been overlapped with even with the materials that being used by the artisans or by the companies. Like we have seen in the beginning that they use the mercury by the small artisans to extract the gold, which is uh, less extraction than the carta, which is used the cyanide. Now we have seen the materials is changing with the models of the economy. I mean the technical process. Then they from the cyanide they change to they jump to urea, which is a kind of activated carbon, and it's still active, so this can extract more than this produced by the Carta and by the Mercury. And with the beginning of the war and the liquidation actually of this of the presence of the state in different parts of the country, we have seen the military economy of everywhere over the country that the armament of artisans themselves. So the gold is become the main source of become the main source of the it's I think we succeed the time.
Yeah, we can. I think there's a couple of questions coming in, but you can complete the point, please.
Okay, I can conclude. I'm concluding with saying that now these models is being changed. Uh, so now with the absence of the governance and absence of a state in different places, now we have seen different armed groups confiscating the land and controlling the gold mining and the gold market in specific areas. You got more gold to buy weapons, and you do the exchange of the weapons protection to the gold mining. So, and this is actually out of the control of the two warring parties at the moment. And there is a kind of explosion of the military economy, the military market, and this militia model at the moment, which is something serious, and unless it being contained by the government soon, it will lead for more fragmentation, even, I mean, probably within the self-control areas and within the RSF control areas. And this is the worst scenario that can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohammed, and thank you very much, Majdi. I think we've got some time to answer questions from the attendees. I will read out the questions, and you can pitch in to answer. So this is a question for Mohammed Amin. You mentioned Block 14 and the European role in gold. Can we get a little more information on that, as most of the literature on gold production focuses on Gulf extraction?
Okay, it's something all that Block 14. You know, it's in the area in the northern Sudan, not far from the border between Sudan and Egypt. Um, and this block has been the concession has been given to Canadian government, Canadian company, sorry, and then it has been confiscated. It has been given to Australian company. Then uh, it's they exchange actually the ownership and the concession of this block between these companies. So up to now, uh, the ownership of this block is belonging to these Western companies, although they have no presence at the moment in the area since the war, but they starting in some talks with the government maybe to return soon to operate in that area. So, and I can share more details with you, Mayada, and you can pass it to.
Of course, thank you. So this is a question on like two questions that are quite similar. I think they can be answered together. So this one is for Mijdi. Given the difficult predicaments in which people in various governments find themselves, what other economic and geopolitical policy alternatives, progressive ones of course, could they have pursued? And where would those alternatives have placed the country? What would the material implications have been in terms of security and military forces? A question that is also very similar to it, so I'll give it to you with it. Are there examples from similar countries of practical alternatives to these IMF prescriptions, which obviously do not work for an economy like Sudan?
Oh, Allah, I wish I knew. I mean, this is not an easy question to answer. And there is an idiom in Arabic about if the trepidations of if. So if opens the door to the devil. So this is a devilish question. Anyway, okay, good. Stop blabbering. Now, answered seriously, there was an answer somewhere in the 60s, and that answer was import substitution. Controls on the capital market, restriction of imports, restriction of consumer product imports, which Sudan up from the 70s, sort of the imports of consumer products started to increase considerably. Substitution of retrenchment so that you can focus on import of capital commodities and the expansion of the local market through industrialization. This is something that most sovereign countries who have managed to come out of this predicament have followed. You can look at any example from the Asian tigers, sort of the few African countries who have managed to escape that trap, to some countries in South America. There's nothing really out of the extraordinary, looking at the experience of countries who have managed to somehow set a different path to development. Look at India, look at Brazil, any country that has managed to establish the local industry and expand its domestic market. And it's called import substitution. Now, this is something that is, in the current day and age, a language from another era, of course. I'm not sure what that would mean in the market economy of today. I don't have that answer. But when these debates were going on in Sudan, up to, and not only necessarily by lefties, so you can, or by communists or socialists, you could read arguments like this from Muhammad Ahmad Mahjoub in the second democratic period, when he was opposed to devaluing. In the first negotiations with Sudan and the IMF, he was opposed to devaluing the Sudanese pound against the US dollar. And he defended that decision with arguments about import substitution. So it wasn't really a foreign currency, foreign in the sense it wasn't completely absurd to say something like this. If you make this argument today in front of, I don't know, a new liberal consensus, it comes out as really weird. And I'm not sure what it would mean in the current world, so I don't have an adequate answer. But I can tell you that at the time when these discussions, when these decisions were made, there were serious discussions about alternative options, not only coming from people like Abdel Khalik Mahjoub, but coming from his liberal twin, Ahmed Ahmed Mahjoub, who was still interested in defending the Sudanese local market in some way or another and not opening it up for all sorts of foreign capital and external interventions.
Thank you, Majdi. Another question. Would the panel agree that historically Sudan's political economy has depended upon the reproduction of unfree labor? Since independence, the nationality laws have been central here. Since the current civil war, this tension has been intensified. Any reconstitution of the state will have to tackle the nationality and land issue. I think I will also revert to you, Majdi and Mohammed, on that. I'm wearing a moderator hat now.
Well, I mean, I understand the question. I understand where it's going. And I think my first response is that what is free labor? I mean, it's a bit difficult to come up with the right answer to that question. What is free labor under the conditions of an African periphery? How would that free labor look like? I understand that, yes, we went from conditions of slavery at one point in time to emancipated slaves turned into wage earners, to seasonal laborers who moved across zones from economic zones, from subsistence zones to the wage earning zones in Jazeera and Gadarif. Ethnicity and race have been sort of employed in that framing of labor relations, and in many ways they've been used to make this exclusion inclusion decisions about who becomes a wage laborer and who doesn't. It's not an easy story, but I think if you take a comparative approach, you will find similar patterns in many other places in the world, and I find trouble imagining what is free labor in a periphery, in an African periphery, in any place in the world, to be honest. Of course, we can work on nationality laws and make them nice. We could probably reframe some of the land laws and make them better. But I'm not sure that if central decisions about nationality and land will resolve the type of crisis and the type of conflicts raging today about land in Darfur. I'm not sure if you can make a decision from some government office and resolve a problem of that nature. And of course, the greatest nationality problem was resolved democratically in Sudan. It just doesn't sound anymore that democratic, but it was resolved democratically through the self-determination of Southern Sudan. Should we repeat that feat in each and every region? Is that the answer? I'd leave it to people to discuss if they think these resolution of identities to the finest mapping possible of identities will resolve the crisis of land and labor relations in Sudan. I personally don't think so.
Thank you, Majdi. So a question from Ahmed Amin. Can you speak more about the Canadian and Australian mining companies operating in Sudan?
Okay. The company is Orca company. Actually, it's something known that it has presence in Sudan since 2013 or 2014. And up to the revolution and then to the eruption of the war, this company has been operating in Sudan. And its condition is not clear. As I said, I mean after the war, because they stopped the war, they stopped the operation, and now they are in talks with the government. That's what imagine. I mean, this company is still, especially Orca, is still being, I mean, not highlighted. And the Block 14 itself, this is called the Nubian, in the Nubian desert of Sudan, and sometimes it's called the Nubian Square. The government, I don't think it's from the government side, but it's from the Canadian company itself that they don't expose to the media at all up to now. Uh, but they started the production, and they started I mean, before the eruption of war, they started the operations, and they started even the exports of the gold from Sudan.
Thank you, Mohammed. So, this is an important question, I think, especially for sort of forward-looking. The main Western narrative is that greed will inevitably drive civil wars in African and other countries. What are the prospects of a political settlement between the main factions which can end the military conflict? After ending the military conflict, what political settlement is feasible to create the conditions for reconstruction and development? As much as a progressive solution is desirable, what would be most viable in keeping the peace in the medium term and resuming development? Presumably, this will involve compromises which many of us may not care for as first best solution. This is a tough one, of course. I think I'll just say something quick about this. I think there is definitely needs to be an understanding that there will have to be some sort of political peace process or negotiation process between the warring factions that will happen. I think what is now sort of continue being sort of contested and negotiated, whether by military operations or by sort of the narrative building or propaganda, is on what is the leverage that both sides are going to have and what is going to be up for negotiation, essentially. And who, what interests or what bodies or what process do both factions represent? And I think, as was mentioned also in some of the questions and of course in the discussion, is that there is sort of a growing sort of a concern or perhaps a reality at this point that the RSF is not autonomous in the sense, it's not representing a constituent that belongs to part of Sudan. And its leadership is operating as a very large, very violent transnational and business entity. And so this is why I think the idea of negotiations themselves or the peace process itself is very sort of difficult to contend with. Yeah, this is not very helpful, but I think it's very complicated. So Majdi and Mohammed, if you guys would like to respond to this query, give your thoughts.
Well, I don't have any thoughts on this query. I'll give it to. I honestly don't know. I don't know. I don't know what type of political process. I don't think this is something that you can sit like myself in a desk somewhere and write up. It's just not going to work. This is probably something that would have to involve the people fighting the war in the first place, the communities that this war has ravaged. It would also involve the many foreign actors involved in the war, and primarily how much money the Emiratis are willing to pour into Sudan over the coming years, and how that is going to change the nature of commodity exchange across Sudan's borders. So I'm not sure that you can sit with some sort of, well, maybe somebody can, but I certainly cannot. I don't have that imagination as a person. So I'm not sure if you can just draw out a political map, use these political science tools to say these guys should sit together, these other guys should sit together. They should come up with some sort of consensus. They should come up with what is it? They should give up this and the other guys should give them that instead, a sort of a transaction. So what is the object of the transaction? So you need to really, in the war between the government of the Khartoum and the government of Khartoum and the SPLM, at the end of that negotiation, was really mattered was there was a single commodity controlled by a military force spread across thousands of kilometers, that could be shared. You could technically share that in number of barrels and foreign earnings. It has an international market that you couldn't really, you needed to go through the open market. You couldn't really sell Sudan's gold in a black market, really. Didn't work. You had to go through the open market. You sold it to China, to Singapore, and these earnings poured into the coffers of two governments who decided to share these earnings instead of fighting over them. So I don't know what can you share if you actually smuggle the commodity, if the conditions of fighting enable you to operate better. It's actually in the favor of at least as far as I can imagine from what Muhammad and others have written about the economy of gold. It's in the favor of these actors that war continues. With these actors, I mean anything but the central government of Sudan is interested, because the central government of Sudan is still interested in, to a degree, in maintaining an export-import economy that passes through Port Sudan and that involves other crops, wildlife, gum arabic, forest crops, groundnuts, involves operations that need peace. But if your entire economy is built on ravaging gold, I'm not sure if you're really interested in a settlement. I can't see where the dividends is. What are you going to give these guys to tell them to put their guns down? If using the guns increases the chance of making a profit, it's the only condition under which they can make a profit. So I think there's you can't really pick up that answer from the record of liberal peacemaking. Like bring two sides to a table, tell them to talk it out, and at the end of the day, they come up with a settlement after 6-7 weeks in some Nairobi or Addis Ababa hotel and a lot of swimming. I'm not sure. I maybe it would work, but I'm not sure and I'm not sure their capability of enforcing that decision also on forces that continue to fight. I'm not sure if there is a central decision from the Dagalo brothers to stop the war, if they can actually stop the war in Guinea. I'm not sure. I would find it a bit. I would doubt it, to be honest. I'm not sure if they can just remotely tell their fighters to stop doing it, and that now we have peace. Maybe they can. I don't know, but I can't see these signs of a centralized power. Otherwise, all the theorization and all the data that Mohammed Amin has been collecting about the decentralized nature of these gold operations becomes null and void. If you can run your own little weeny meeny militia, why do you need the Dagalo brothers?
Thank you, Majdi. So
yeah, let me also add something short here. Magdi talked about the grassroots solution. Maybe this is one of the key thing, because I do agree with him that we cannot sit from the desk in Cairo or wherever and talking about the solution. But there were actually some attempts of that. I mean, there were grassroots groups, I mean, in the gold issue. They were organized themselves even before the 2019, before the revolution, and they started working. They were a conference even in they work in different directions. It's although maybe you can have notices on that work here or there, but they were started working against against the companies, against the land grabbing, against the environmental impact, etc. So, and there was a conference in 2020, I think, uh, by the majority of the grassroots initiatives that working in this front. I mean, from perspective of environmental impact, whatever, and they have I think reasonable recommendations, and it's recommendations that coming from on the ground. Uh, but what happened actually? This is can discover to you the scene. I mean, the picture that these recommendations have been neglected. It has been handed to the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and it has been neglected by him. And he said openly that they cannot go in confrontation with the monopoly of this market by the armed groups, which is by that time the both, I mean, SAF leadership and the RSF militia. So and even the sponsor, I mean, the civilian sponsor of that conference, he was the Sovereign Council member, Sadiq Tower, and he said the same that no, unless you have these companies with you together, guys, in the conference, and you come to this, you come to this conclusion together. He made the negotiation with the companies, negotiation with the companies of the security organs, of SAF, of RSF, of the other businessmen, and all the private sector and the maybe foreign investors. So, and it's clear that they contain, I mean, together the liberal civilians and the two military wings, and I can say the old network of the old regime that protecting, I mean, the economic empire that protecting these interests with the new liberals that have new interests, which is have some overlapping with the old ones, according to the partnership that made between the two sides, and and brokered by the international community. So when we go to this level from down to up, we can understand, I mean, the grassroots, which is can be the key of the solution in the past, and maybe even now, and who opposite it. I mean, in the whole levels, like from the military up to the liberals, then to the international community, which is uh, also standing uh, against this popular solution of this of the goal of the interest around the gold, and even the war and the prolonging of war and the attempt of the liberal peace, and how so and as I mentioned in one of the examples that we have the Volkswagen, for example, in Germany, buying the dirty gold that being looted by the RSF from the Khartoum refinery, and the peace, the humanitarian conference. I mean, at the same time that Volkswagen, which is their thing, they are hosting a humanitarian conference uh, to bring the aid to the Sudanese people. So in the same, I mean, in the same example, as I said, the Switzerland company, which is also bought the same gold in Switzerland, and we have seen even a few kilometers from in Geneva that the international community is saying that they are putting pressure on the two sides to bring them to the negotiation table. So I don't think that is serious. So it's I mean, in a such world that I'm like my deal. I'm not sure if this kind of track can lead to anything. I know it's very hard for the grassroots and for the Sudanese communities alone to make peace or to come to any happy conclusion of this war. But uh, I think we have to put aside this old tracks. Actually, I think maybe this can be a key point of beginning towards I mean, stabilize peace in Sudan.
Thank you very much, Majdi and Mohammed. Thank you very much for your time and for your inputs. We're gonna have to close, unfortunately. I'm really sorry to everyone whose questions we did not have time to get to. They're very interesting questions in the chat, but I'm mindful of everyone's time. Thank you very much to everyone who joined, who listened, who engaged. Obviously this is a very important topic for us, and of course also a very personal one. So we really do appreciate all of the engagement. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you.
Bye.
طيب يا ميادة شكرا.
يا حلشني يا دكتور، والله يعني شكرا لك شديد.
كتر خيرك والله ما قصرت يعني أسئلة.
شكرا يا ميادة.
العفو يا أستاذ.
أسئلة قوية جدا.
أسئلة كثيرة.
طيب تصبحوا على خير.
يلا مع السلامة.
يلا مع السلامة يا ميادة. يلا يا مجد.
يلا
Yeah.
مع السلامة.
يلا جاوب.
Mayada, it's been recorded. Do you need a recording?
Yes, please. It would be helpful to have it. You already did, right?